Okay, this video is on the best open random players of 2022. Yeah, let's get started. So I'm basing this on data from weekly opens and the monthly open fund GBs. It seems like one of those happens each year, so I'm including the one that happened in December 2022. I took a bunch of different measures. You're going to see all the scores for the different players, but the measures are win rate, which is wins plus ties, a half of ties over total games played. So a win is a win, a loss is a loss, a tie is halfway in between. Now, most of these formats, GBs, the monthly GBs, you really want to win a lot of games. The weekly opens, what you really want to do is have a good win to loss ratio. If you have a bunch of ties but still win, that's fine. That can get you fantastic results. So I also took just pure win to loss ratio where ties are excluded. And I also took games played because I think maintaining a high level of play over a large number of games is substantially more impressive than maintaining it over not very many games. It also makes it less likely that you happen to face a streak of either weaker opponents or opponents who happen to be on off days. The bigger sample of games there is, the more likely you faced a normal set of opponents and the data is reliable. We're going to have some more advanced evaluations of player quality as well. Invincibility rate is the percentage of games a player played where they never made a move that put them in a lost position. So if you got a random that was a forced loss, that does not count as being not invincible. Technically, I guess that's not invincible, but how I'm using invincibility, if you got a forced loss from your random, the opponent made their starter, every move of yours was losing, that is not going to be counted as part of this score. What will be counted, however, is every time a move was made that put you in a losing position, but it can only happen once per game. So there are games where, someone has a terrible position, like off the starter, 2 moves tie, you don't find one of those 2 moves, because that's incredibly hard to do and rare to do. You get a lost position. The opponent doesn't quite play the win, but again, you have like 1 or 2 ties, again, you miss it. One way of scoring that, I could count you as having 2 blunders, 2 failures of invincibility, but I maximize it at 1 time per game because there are patterns to that happening, and I don't think they're very indicative of a player making more mistakes. I think they're indicative of just getting a horrendous random that is just very difficult to deal with. Flawless rate is how many games that where no mistakes were made by you. So it's not only did you not make any losing mistakes, but if there was a chance to win the game, you always took it and never gave up the chance to win. You always played, it's not quite perfectly because I think you could play flawlessly, but there could have been moves that were higher pressure. But the idea is you made no mistakes. If you were winning, you won. If you were not losing, you didn't lose. And finally, quality of play. This is the most complex measure I have, but I have done an extensive regression with various inputs that estimates the odds of a player winning at each point in the game. And the quality of play measure says, okay, it saw your random and you're on first turn, and it thought you were 52% to win. After your first move, it jumped to 58% to win. So you're given +6 for that move. After their move, maybe it stayed at 58%. After your next move, it dropped to 55%. So your first move was +6, your next move was -3. Over the course of a game, you get a score for that game. And your quality of play is your average score for a game. So it's kind of the percentage above or below what the formula expected. Incidentally, 0 sounds like it would end up being average there. 0 is clearly above average by this metric. But if someone puts up a +5, that means it thinks they're 5% better than the mean player performance, but because stronger players go further in tournaments, it's getting more games from the very top end of players, and thus a 0 score is actually a well above average score in quality of play. And that's the concept behind it. So it does things like sometimes someone misses a win but plays a very high pressure move, and the flawless rate will say you screwed up, and the quality of play then we'll say, you had a very high chance of winning. I actually think you still have a very high chance of winning. This was a good move and will not be docking you points there. But it depends on the situation. Sometimes you miss a win, it will dock you. Sometimes you miss a win, it'll think that win was really hard and you played a great move and you're probably still going to win the game and will give you credit for it, right? It's going to vary more based on the situation. So similarly, if you have a horrible random, and there's like 2 moves out of 40 that don't lose, and you play a losing move, invincibility will say you screwed up, but quality of play might say this was actually a pretty good defense given the circumstances. So I'm going to use this set of measures. I'm going to exclude players who are under 15 games played. Specifically, there are 2 players, Slash of Time and Vid, who played the December GB, and they would have scores that would qualify them for this list. But as everyone else here played, the lowest on the list is 29 games played in these tournaments over the course of the year, I thought it wasn't right to include them. And I identified the 9 best open random players of 2022. These are the only 9 players that maintained a score greater than 0 for the year. Again, greater than 0 is a really good score. And I ranked these 9 players. So anyone making this list is an achievement. There were a whole number of players that had streaks, runs of a weekly opener 3, where they were on pace to be clearly over 0, but did not maintain it for the year. I guess I'll say 10th place was Yevon, who I thought was going to make it, but had a few bad results at the edges that dropped him off. So I stuck with the top 9 because I liked the idea of everyone who averaged greater than 0. Again, really hard to average greater than 0. A couple caveats. Some game records were poorly kept. Either I wrote the game down wrong and thus it didn't make sense, or it was listed wrong by a player and I didn't check it while we still could look at the game. And then also I can't use my computer program to do games that have E, so any round, with E gets lost. And that specifically means that if you lost in rounds with Elemental, you get higher scores. You may think this benefits me. Actually, I'm not the main beneficiary, but it does mess with things. Let's take a look. And I'll soon be doing a similar ranking for 2021 because I have all those games as well. And hopefully at the end of 2023, I'll do another one, or maybe I'll do a mid-year check-in. But I thought this was a fun way to look at stuff, and I wanted to celebrate these 9 players. It won't be unexpected names or anything, but it will be some impressive runs. So in 9th, we have Tezuka. And just showing how hard it is to put up a high win rate, he is under 50% in win rate and in win-loss ratio in weekly opens over the year. And Tezuka played great this year. I mean, obviously he won TTAC, but I think he played great in general. One thing this really indicates is it's really hard to be over 50% in elimination tournament formats. If you think about it, in the first round, half of the players are going to lose. So 50% of players are going 0-1. Of the remaining half of the players, half of those lose in the second round and go 1-1. So out of every 4 players, 2 of them are going out round 1, 1 of them is going out round 2. Only 1 out of every 4 puts up a record better than 50% in any tournament. So because of the format we have for most tournaments, it is just incredibly difficult to be a greater than 50% player, especially when most of these weekly opens, there are 9 players on this list. Usually a whole bunch of those 9 are playing, and a lot of these are going to be playing each other. And it's not like the people who aren't on this list can't beat the players here. Many of them have many times. So this is to say, if performing near 50% for any length of time is actually a really impressive achievement. So Tezuka is 9th in the win rate stuff, 6th in games played, and 8th in the general quality of play measures. In almost 60% of games, he was never losing. In 50% of games, he played flawlessly, and a quality of plus 3.9. We'll see the scale of this metric, but is pretty solid here. And Tezuka would have placed a spot higher if not for getting lazy during the Xmas GB and throwing a bunch of positions there. So let's move on to 8th place, Vialva. We have our first player who hits 50%. In the quality metrics, he's the lowest of our 9, but he did it over a really large amount of games, which, again, I think ups how I'd consider those numbers. And also, I took standard deviations of people's quality of play game by game, and Villalba has a higher standard deviation of level of play than any other player on this list, which is to say he's clearly the least consistent player on this list. His games range in quality more than anyone else's here, and there are patterns to it. He has lots of tournaments where he goes out round 1, he goes out round 1 in the first game, and he plays a really poor game. On the other hand, if he survives the first game or two of a tournament, even if we don't know if he's advanced yet, but especially if he advances, his level of play for that tournament is likely to be really high. And so we end up getting him coming here in 8th, but he is, as I said, the least consistent player here in our top 9, though we will also identify some of the less consistent players in our top 7. In 7th, we have Piggyman, who played a whole bunch of games. He didn't play as much towards the end of the year, but at the start of the year, he was playing a lot. And the number that pops out here is clearly his invincibility score. He is very difficult to beat. In only a quarter of games is he losing, and it is quite a few less than that than he loses, because of course people are not punished every time they make a mistake. And there are some situations where it's just extremely complicated to find how to beat them. 75% invincibility is really, really high. But overall here, he looks like about right at 7th. There's a pretty clear jump from 8th to 7th here, but I think the top 6 all have better cases than he does. You'll notice, again, very close to 50% win rate. Only at the very top of the list will we start hitting 60% win rate, and only at the very top of the list will we be hitting things like 60-70 win-loss ratio. But yeah, I think the really impressive thing for Piggyman, and this has been true in just all samples of games I've taken for Piggy, just such a difficult player to beat. And now in 2 different tournaments, one a major, one I think the SPID tournament, reunion tournament, I've thought I was winning against him. And in a best of 3 format, I've thought I'm up 1-0 and I'm going to close it out here. And in both games, he found a tie and went on to beat me the next 2 games, maybe with some ties in between, depending on which one. But a very difficult player to get wins against. Really impressive invincibility. In 6th, we have Seto. Didn't play a lot. 2nd lowest games played on this list. So 8th there. But you'll notice his win rates are really elite. And his flawless rate's really high. The quality metric does not particularly like his games. The quality metric was lower on Seto than I expected it to be. But I think this is to say, Seto creates a type of complications that it's not great at evaluating. It's based on a regression. It's based on understanding the average of everyone's play and what you'd expect given the average of everyone. And Seto is, I think, an extremely unique player, and you would expect it to not quite get him right. That said, Seto didn't play much. When he played, he was very, very good. In 5th, we have Sir Smokes. Now, you could argue for switching 5th and 6th. Seto, in general, was higher on most metrics, though Smokes played a little more. But Smokes pulled ahead on quality, where he has an insane score. That's within a point of the highest score anyone got. That's very close to number 1. It evaluated him as a player who just puts a ton of pressure on his opponents. And also evaluated him as a quite inconsistent performer. Of the top 7, so if we exclude Villalba, he's the 2nd most inconsistent performer. And I think this fits with him being quite intuitive and a very quick player who goes with his first instinct, and often his first instinct is very good, but sometimes it isn't quite calculated, right? And so he can be all over the place. But man, does my quality metric love how Smokes plays. It thinks he puts the pressure on, and that his opponents have very few paths to ties, and he is consistently making it combative and difficult for them to make good decisions. Alright, so we have a jump to our top 4. You can probably at this point guess who the top 4 are. And let's just go to them. In 4th, we have Akiyama. Now, His games played with 100. I thought it was fun that he was exactly 100. I'm kind of glad a couple games were lost to Elemental so we could get the perfect 100. Really means I think you should take his numbers as even better as than they are, because every player is going to have times when they're more invested and less invested, and the more one picks and chooses when they play, the more likely you're going to get the times when you're, in good form, putting in effort, caring about the game. And Akiyama played throughout the year, played throughout ups and downs, and so his numbers are likely to be a little lower than if he had been choosy. And he shouldn't be choosy. You should play more. You should win more. I'm saying that the games played is a very strong indication that his real numbers are even stronger than these look. That said, these look real good. Quality of plus 8.7 is basically averaging the strength of like a runner-up of a weekly open, which obviously means frequently winning those weekly opens. And yeah, I guess all the quality numbers here look kind of middle of the pack. They're very, very good. We got a pretty big jump in quality here from anyone other than Sir Smokes that we've seen. But just given how many games it was sustained over, I put him fourth, and I think he has a case for third. Though I am biased towards the person in third for reasons you might be able to figure out. So whenever I make a list like this, I always, somewhere in me want to put myself first. Or even if I don't put myself first, like to think to myself, yeah, I could have been first, I could have put myself first. But I think in this case, I was a lot closer to being fourth than first. I don't think I have a very good argument for first, but I do think there's a pretty good argument Akiyama should be ahead of me. I didn't play that much. Now, the quality of play metrics do really like my play. I made very few losing mistakes. When I was winning, I gave very few chances to survive. My pressure was really high. I have first, second in those categories. Obviously, that is very good. But I think it's indicative that my win rate and win-loss ratio are not near as good as those really good background numbers suggest. One thing is that whenever I was losing, I basically did lose. Specifically, Delial was very good at punishing the lost positions I reached. But I also think this is on me. This is something where when I was in trouble, I did not put up sufficient resistance. So I was really good at avoiding trouble, but when in trouble, I did not survive as much as I'd like. And that leads to a lower win-loss ratio. Now, that might be something small sample. Over time, I'd survive more, but I really think I did poorly there, and I think the lower win rates bear that out. And also, I played the fewest games in this group. So I think there's an argument I should be higher, but there's a better argument I should be lower, and I thought third felt right. In second place, we have Delial, who has the highest win rate. The second highest win-loss ratio, is high on games played, is very hard to beat, and even harder to survive if you're behind. His flawless rate really, really high. And his quality is fourth, but the gap between fourth and first is like 1.2, and the gap between fourth and fifth is like 2 points. So his gap to first is clearly smaller than his gap to fifth here. So by quality, it looks like fourth, but it's really more like there's a four-way pretty close tie for first there. He also, and this is not that unexpected, is the least consistent player in the top 7. Varies the most game to game of anyone. Again, we have to exclude Vialva here, but he is the one that varied the most, and that's despite having a number near the top of the list. In general, the higher numbers and higher win rate you have, the more consistent you're going to be, because the fewer losses that are in there, obviously those are going to mess with consistency. So that he has such a high win rate and still shows up as the most inconsistent players of the top 7 is to say Deli has a weakness, and it's that sometimes he sees things just magnificently and sometimes things don't click. That said, I mean, he's second here. He has a case for first. He has the best win rate of anyone. He has really good underlying numbers. When they're fourth, they're very close behind the very top finishers, and in the flawless rate, he is clearly higher than first. I think Deli is a deserving second placer here. But our winner, who was also my winner of the yearly power rankings of 2022, really had a phenomenal year. Turds. Second highest win rate, but when you look at win-loss ratio, which is usually more indicative of performance in weekly opens, because obviously if you tie a lot but then win, you still get through. And there are a lot more weekly opens than there are things like GBs, where you really gotta win immediately. You can't tie first. Turds is in first with the best win-loss ratio. He's second in games played, so he maintained this performance over a long time, and his underlying numbers are phenomenal. He was the second hardest player to get a winning position against, eking out slightly tougher to get a winning position against than Piggyman. He's third in flawless rate, and his quality metrics, those numbers thought he was just putting so much pressure on his opponents game after game. He wasn't the most consistent performer, but he was right in the pack for most consistent. It was very close. I think Akiyama and I came out as the most consistent, and Turds third there, but all within a tight bunch. So overall, like, when I look at these secondary tournaments for the year, obviously you can look at GBs and, Delhi just dominates those. But when you look at the non-GB secondary tournaments, and specifically the kind of random stuff, you can see how Turds earned my Power Ranking Player of the Year, because he was superb throughout. This is clearly the best resume in these tournaments of the year. To do it over 87 games is remarkable. Averaging plus 11.7. Again, that's an average. Like, he averaged a plus 11.7. The recent chat tournament that just ended, Akiyama won it with a plus 18, and Midas came second, playing very well with a plus 9. And there were 3 other players greater than 0, and 11 of the 16 were below 0. So again, being over 0 is already difficult. Averaging over 0 is difficult. And Turds' average was somewhere between Midas' second place and Akiyama's winning performance. And that's just an extremely high average by this quality measure. There are issues with my quality measure, but I quite like it, and I'm going to keep applying it and see how far we get with it. And yeah, again, congrats to Turds, who had a really remarkable 2022 coming for you in 2023. At least I hope so. Yeah, so hope this was interesting. Probably not too many unexpected faces here, if any, but yeah, wanted a new way of looking at stuff, and I'm sort of figuring out report cards I want to have for tournaments kind of thing, of what does it look like? Because something the quality metric can say is like, hey, you went out in round 1, but you played 3 really good ties and you had a tough fought loss. This is actually a really good performance. And it could also say, hey, you won 2 rounds and lost in round 3, and your 2 wins were not very good and your loss was terrible. And so it is a metric capable of saying that, this performance is better than that, even though the win rate's different. And I think that's useful to have around. I just had another thought. Has it escaped my head? When you have a thought halfway through a sentence, but you want to finish what you're saying, and you've completely lost that thought by the end of the sentence. So what was I talking about? I was talking about, comparing... one thing quality doesn't do is it doesn't adjust for opposition. And I think that's pretty important, right? I think it is easier to play well against less difficult opponents. And that's part of why I think using weekly opens is a pretty good sample, because you don't get to control who your opponents are. And as long as your game count gets pretty big, if you're winning games, you're going to get paired against people in the later rounds. And even if you're lucky with first round pairings, which is pretty hard to beat because basically everyone playing these weekly opens is really good, you're going to have a pretty difficult sample of opponents, and they're going to look kind of similar. But it is worth saying, I don't adjust for strength of opposition here. There's no adjustment there. So, if you had a 15-game match against whoever you think is the best player on the site, then sure, this is probably going to underrate you, because that's probably more impressive than it looked. On the other hand, if you played a 15-game match against the best player on the site, you probably played awesome, and the quality metric will now say you played awesome for 15 games or whatever. Another thing it doesn't adjust for is rule set. It has some kind of built-in understandings that will help it adjust, but it doesn't specifically know what rule set is being played. It just gets some outputs from it. And That's not quite true. I don't know how to say this right without actually like explaining all the underlying stuff, which nobody wants. But there is a chance that like getting certain rule sets will just lead to higher or lower scores. And, if you happen to play really well in a tournament that happens to have rule sets that happen to lead to low scores, I'm not sure what those would be, by the way, then there might be, some effects there of just which tournaments people happen to play. Yeah, I think that's it. And again, congrats to Tur. It's truly a wonderful 2022 for him in just terms of quality of play.